Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be going over the new legislation that's being proposed. Please, we welcome you all, board members and managers, to today's webinar. I have the great pleasure of being here with Lisa from KBR, as well as Sinisa from the Falcon Group. We are opening the webinar for questions. So if you have any questions, please click on the bottom. You'll see Q&A or on the top of your screen. We'll do our best to get to the questions throughout the webinar. As a friendly reminder, what we're going to be discussing today is going to be legislation that's being proposed. At the moment, it hasn't gone into law. However, we felt it was our duty to be able to keep everyone abreast of what's going on, what the potential changes are, how it's going to impact your association, and at the same time, be able to get some feedback from you, because all of us here are involved in some way or connected with our legislators. And again, if we can provide any input that can help our associations, I believe all of us will do that. So why don't we start off with some introductions? Lisa, if you'd be so kind to give a small introduction about yourself and the firm you represent.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. This is really important stuff, and it could represent major changes for community association leaders in the following few years. My name is Lisa McGill. I'm an attorney with K. Bender Rembaum. I've been practicing in this field for 20-something years and board certified by the Florida Bar in condominium and planned unit development law, also a fellow with the College of Community Association Lawyers. Our firm, K. Bender Rembaum, we have physical offices in 3 areas of the state: Broward County, Palm Beach County, and the Tampa Bay, Hillsborough County area. But we service associations throughout the state. As you are aware, everybody that's participating today, most everything is done via email or video call or what have you. So we're able to service our clients from various locations. Look forward to participating today. Love working with established professionals like you both.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Next up, we have Sinisa with the Falcon Group. Sinisa, if you'd be so kind to give us an introduction.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for having me on this panel. My name is Sinisa. I'm one of the principals at the Falcon Group. Falcon Group is the consulting engineering forensic company, and we have been working for the past 25 years, assisting condominiums and HOAs for all of their engineering needs. We've been in Florida market for the past 7 or 8 years and working with a lot of condominiums and HOAs, assisting for throughout the life of the property. And we are very closely involved with 40-year inspections, which are the basis of any new law changes that are coming potentially as part of this new proposed legislation. So it is our interest to be included and involved and understand the changes that are coming and share them with you, so we can all be prepared for what is potentially coming.
Thank you so much, Sinisa. We're happy to have you on board. As for myself, my name is Rafael Aquino. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Affinity Management Services. We are a community association management company. We service Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. As Lisa mentioned, as Sinisa both mentioned, we're very involved with what's going on. And we're all about being able to provide education when it comes to the changes, as well as everything that has to do with condo and homeowner association management. We are a specialized organization, more of a boutique operation. So our core focus is really working with associations that align with our core values, as well as with our processes and the way we like things to work throughout our associations. So with further ado, I think, why don't we get started? There's so many changes. Last night, there was a change in a bill, so there's so much going on. It's challenging at times to be able to keep up. But again, I think between the 3 of us, we should be able to give some insight of what's to come or what is being proposed to come. So Lisa, I wanted to start with you. If you can kind of give us an idea of the pending bills that you believe are going to impact our associations. I know that there were recommendations done by the Florida Bar. I know CAI had their recommendations. So if you can give us a little bit, kind of 30,000 foot of what's been incorporated from those recommendations into the current bills.
Well, there's a whole plethora of legislation that would impact community associations this year. Not all of it relates to the inspection, the engineering inspections and reserve studies. There are also bills filed that would impact construction defect handling and various other matters that refer to associations. But right now, the two bills that seem to be most likely to move forward are both in the Senate. One is 7042 and the other one is 1702, sponsored by Senator Bradley. They contain very similar information about the inspection reports. If you're in Miami-Dade or Broward County, you're familiar with the 40-year reinspection, which is a safety inspection within the 40-year period, and it evaluates the structure and the electrical systems in the building. These bills would expand that type of a program a little bit farther than it is right now, statewide, and contemplate having the first inspection at 30 years with 10-year inspections thereafter, except for buildings that are coastal, where the first inspection would be after 20 years and then 7 years thereafter. The inspection consists of 2 phases. The first phase is very similar to the 40-year inspection, which we'll have Sunisa discuss in a little bit more detail. But if the design professional finds deterioration or defects or signs of distress in the first phase, then you go on to the second phase, and the second phase is intended to be a little bit more intrusive, where there could be some destructive testing performed. Regardless of which phase you are required to complete, the design professional not only provides the report to the association, to the board of directors, but is also required under these bills to provide the report to the local building official. And that's regardless of what the report reveals. So that's a big change from what we have with respect to general inspections to prepare for concrete restoration or roof replacement or other repairs that you would do on a normal basis.
Okay, excellent. And I know that there's some other big impacts, which I'm looking forward to getting into, especially when it comes to reserves. But I think it would be a great opportunity, Sinisa, for you to give us an idea of what the difference is. As Lisa mentioned, that there's a phase 1 and potentially a phase 2. Maybe from your side of it, from the engineering side, what are going to be the potential impacts to our association, and maybe give a high level of what the difference is between a phase 1 as well as a phase 2.
Sure. So in general, the one thing that didn't change is who is going to be allowed or who's going to be certified to perform at least phase 1 inspection. And that still remains to be a licensed professional engineer or an architect in the state of Florida. So that still remains the same. However, for phase 1, it's meant to be, as Lisa said, very similar to what we know now as a 40-year inspection for Broward and Miami-Dade, which is basically a visual inspection of the structural and habitable and non-habitable spaces in the building, at which point the engineer will make a determination whether the building has passed or failed that type of inspection. In the event that the building has passed and engineer's determination, building is in good shape, no other action is necessary. However, if the building is, deemed to have issues, to have structural distress, as defined in the bill, or maybe further revised, then the building will be required to go to a phase 2. Phase 2, pursuant to the current language in the bill, would have to be performed by a structural engineer that has a 5-year experience in design and 5 years experience in inspections of the properties, and may include a various destructive investigation of testing, in addition to additional visual observations of the property that would clarify any type of issue that were observed in phase 1, and make a determination whether those are structural in nature and whether the building is actually in safe structural condition or not, and based on that, provide recommendations for further actions and repairs, or again, give the building a clean bill of health if that is the actual case.
Excellent. I know prior to our webinar today, we were talking about the differences with engineers, and I guess if you can kind of stay there and talk a little bit about in the state of Florida, since probably most of our listeners are within the state of Florida, is there a difference between a structural engineer and a professional engineer, or even now that the conversations being had within these bills are being written with when it comes to like a threshold inspection, who can do it? So maybe if you can give us an idea of the difference and how things work here in Florida.
Sure. So the term professional engineer implies somebody who has, obviously the degree in engineering and has certain years of experience, and also has passed the test that is required for somebody to be certified as a professional engineer. In Florida, there are two types of tests. Well, not Florida, United States, there are two types of tests. One is for professional engineer with a certain trade. So professional engineer mechanical, professional engineer electrical, professional engineer civil, and also structural. However, there was a new testing adopted that has a term structural engineer. It's a different test than a professional engineer with a structural designation, a different test and a different designation in different states. However, in Florida, whether you pass one or the other, you get the same designation as a professional engineer. So Florida does not distinguish between somebody who has a structural test and non-structural test. That there have been attempts for many years now for that to change. For whatever reason, it hasn't, or hasn't moved a lot. There is talking about that being implemented now, and I've seen some proposed languages of actually instituting the designation of a structural engineer. This bill does not require one or the other. It just requires to be a professional engineer, and again, for phase 2, to have a certain experience. Right now in the state of Florida, there is a term called threshold engineer. And a threshold engineer is somebody who has knowledge, experience, certification, has to be a licensed professional engineer who can perform a certain type of inspections on certain type of properties. The threshold, the designation of threshold, is basically to imply the size of the property that you're allowed to inspect. Basically, for the properties up to 3 stories in height and certain square footage and certain occupancy, anybody who has a professional license can inspect. However, not design, inspect. This is purely for inspection purposes. But for buildings that go above that threshold, you have to have that special designation. Because the requirements for that designation are very strict in terms of required experience and knowledge, the state has instituted a new designation called Threshold Inspector Limited, which basically allows certain number of engineers that may not qualify for the full threshold inspector, but has sufficient knowledge and experience in inspecting buildings to acquire that license and become inspectors for repairs of the building. So for certain buildings that require, facade repair, concrete restoration, that are not substantial structural repairs, that are those, concrete repairs on the edges and stucco repairs and things like that, that are most 95% of the time we have on our buildings. So that designation is now, exists, so people can, perform those inspections because, and we'll get into this, there's going to be a shortage of engineers, and there's going to be a shortage of licenses that are qualified to perform this amount of work in the state of Florida. Miami-Dade and Broward are struggling currently with this, and there are only 2 counties that have the current 40-year inspection requirements. Once this becomes a statewide law, nobody knows what's going to happen with that.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I know we've been experiencing it from our side where, we're trying to take proactive measures with our associations. We've been trying to tell those associations that maybe you're not that close. You're getting close to the 40 year, not to wait for that time to come, because if legislation does come pass and a lot of these things that we're going to be discussing today do come into law, there's going to be an influx of calls and associations wanting to get these reports done. So taking that proactive measure now, making sure, as you stated, I mean, if the legislators are putting it to law, it's because there is a concern that, you know, all of a sudden there's going to be people coming into this business because, you know, certain things come into law that opens up business opportunities for others. But either way, we want to make sure that we're working with industry experts that have the knowledge and years of experience, not just someone that all of a sudden, you know, is an engineer, which, you know, you have your license and so forth, but that hasn't necessarily inspected structures in the past. You know, our associations shouldn't have to bear that cost if they do something saying that it's correct, and in reality, it's not. You know, especially with what occurred, you know, a tragedy at Surfside has pretty much opened up Pandora's box. As a lot of our legislators have seen that, listen, a lot of things within our condo associations weren't necessarily being done right. It's not with all, because you do have associations that have, you know, done everything by the book. But like everything else, you're going to have certain associations that didn't, you know, they wanted to kick the can down the road. And now, unfortunately, if these things do go into law, there's going to be many changes, and many owners within these condo associations are going to feel the impacts of those decisions that were made for years, whether they were right or wrong. It's too late to determine that right now. Right now, what we're going to have to do is bear with the issue and see how we manage it from a legal side, from an engineering side, from a board side, and from a resident side. So Lisa, I wanted to kind of jump back to you. And I know that one of the things that are being proposed in multiple bills, I know a big thing is reserves, how reserves are going to be funded, the format that they should be funded. In some cases, they're mentioning of having it in a straight line method if it's for certain items. One of the bills is stating that it needs to be fully funded by X date, by January of, I believe it was, July of 2024. So I guess if you could give our listeners a little bit of an insight of what you've been reading, as well as, does this impact only condos and co-ops, or does it impact HOAs as well?
Okay, well, I want to stress that you shouldn't conflate or equate a reserve study with an engineering inspection. I mean, a reserve study is really a budget planning tool to identify the components for which the association bears responsibility, to inform the board members and the unit owners as to the expected remaining useful life of those components, so they can prepare to attend to the major or substantial repairs or replacement when it's time. An engineering inspection is completely different. Now, engineers, there are many engineers that perform reserve studies. It's, so, you know, part of their practice, but it's not necessary to have a PE license in order to perform a reserve study. I advocate for hiring a professional reserve analyst, and there are various organizations that accredit it, reserve analyst, because otherwise you won't have an accurate picture of what, well, especially of what components for which the association is responsible. I often see community associations that say, oh, we're fully reserved. And I take a look at the schedule and I know that they have, you know, their elevators would not be on there, or roads would not be on there, or, you know, surface water management, if it's an HOA, may not be on there. So having the components defined is really, really important. Obviously, an engineering inspection is for to determine whether there is any deterioration or defects or decay that requires immediate repair, and to specify the repairs that are necessary, you know, plus of course make improvements or calculate whether the changes in use of the building have in any way modified any of the you know, structural issues. Going back to the legislation, it's very much in flux right now, very, very much in flux. Yeah. So what the legislators really need to do is carefully make that distinction between the engineering inspection and the reserve study, because the schedules will seem very, very aggressive if they're required to do both. I mean, the cost associated with each kind of task, obviously, there's a very huge differential there too. So, but the reserve, what's being proposed is that the reserve schedule and the reserve study include all of the components that are listed in another part of the statute for developers to perform a transition or a transition inspection report. And that's, you know, pools, seawalls, elevators, roofs, exterior structure, far beyond the roof, paving, and painting that is already in the statute. Now, in my mind, the statute says right now, the existing statute, or anything that will cost more than $10,000 to substantially repair or replace. Well, elevators, pools, seawalls, all of that should have already been in the schedule. So it's just a matter of determining, really more defining what needs to be evaluated. As far as the funding is concerned, I mean, again, that's also in flux. So the proposal that 7042, which is, in the process, it's always being discussed, and it's very frenetic up there in Tallahassee. I can tell you, we speak to our lobbyists, daily, basically. Is for the association to have it either fully funded or to have an alternative funding mechanism. And that alternative funding mechanism would exclude a special assessment for the actual repair. So the only thing that I've seen as an alternative funding mechanism is to have an ongoing line of credit or, some kind of a loan available so that you have those funds immediately available. There's some problems with that. I mean, if you speak to any of the accountants, they'll say, no, you can't fund reserves with debt. I mean, basically what you're doing is incurring indebtedness to fund a future expense. So reserves are not intended to fund basically your restorative or remedial repairs. They're intended for you to be able to be on a schedule so that you have money when the time is necessary. So again, that's all in flux. There are also some discussion as to whether to bifurcate the reserves, where reserves for the components that are structural in nature or contribute to the structural integrity of the building must be fully funded either with cash or with this alternative funding mechanism, and reserves for other items that may not support the structure. I mean, reserves would arguably and do include furniture, fixture, and equipment, beautification items, exterior fencing, and the like. So if we have the bifurcated schedule, it may be more palatable to obtain the alternative funding mechanism, which is really designed for like an immediate expense. So if something happens tomorrow, you have the money available so that you can go ahead and attend to the repair rather than have to wait, levy a special assessment, collect part of the special assessment, or make arrangements to get a loan and levy an assessment to secure the loan. So that's really what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think as you stated earlier, they're doing everything they can to try to protect the interest of our associations and its residents, especially after the tragedy. But as you mentioned, like my opinion on the alternative fund, it's just not clear enough of what it means. The position I've been taking is, yes, in today's day and age, it's easy to get a line of credit as long as you have, your delinquencies are under control. There's a certain threshold calculation. And most banks are willing to lend to associations, especially if they specialize within our world. The challenge that I find is, we've been in a market where it's been high for a very long time, and every market comes down. There's upswings and downswings, and rates are set to go up. We don't know where they're going to be. If we do go through some kind of crisis, whether it be, again, not trying to fearmonger here, but if we go through some kind of crisis like 08 or 2000, banks normally retract on the lending side. And what happens if that's when the association needs the money to do what they need to do? Because these lines of credits, they can be pulled at any time, depending on where the financial position of the association stands. So again, I understand it's very difficult of trying to juggle all these balls where we're not just automatically forcing reserves onto everybody for these associations that haven't had any. But there's more thought that needs to be put into it of how we're going to manage through this. Because, again, last thing we want is associations to start taking the position, well, I have a line of credit. Well, what does it mean? Do you have to have an approved line of credit? Or does it mean that you just have to have a pre-approved letter? There's always, I guess, a gray side of how these things can be positioned. And I would like a little more clarity there so that we can do what's right for our communities, because the cost of living in a condo, I think, like we've all have said, is going to go up. I know we're seeing it from Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, where they're requesting how much reserves these associations are having. They're becoming much smarter with their questions. I mean, they have this particular questionnaire that's has a ton of questions, and they're asking better questions now. So buyers are more informed because naturally we're in a world where information is readily available. And I believe as time continues to pass, there's going to be more questions. So if you're on a board or if you're a manager for a community where your associations are weak or you don't have any, you need to start having these serious conversations with your board members and your residents at the same time. You don't need to carry all that weight on your own. I mean, this is legislation that's potentially going to be passed. So it doesn't hurt to start communicating this to your residents so that if it does go into law, that, you know, you've already preempted them of what's going on, why it's going to happen, how we're going to prepare as an association, what measures management or the board is taking to communicate this so that it's not just from one day to the next. We're in October in budget season. By the way, we never had reserves. We need to fully fund or 50% fund. You know, it's going to be a sticker shock to many.
If you don't mind, if I can just add to that, I mean,
Sure.
the obligations are not new. Maybe the inspection requirements are new, but a board has a fiduciary obligation to act in good faith with the care of a reasonably prudent person and in the best interest of the association. So the maintenance, care, preservation, insurance of the property has always been a primary role of the association acting through its board of directors. So some may consider this type of legislation a little bit parental in nature, but it really is. There's now a realization that the failure to regulate, or at least the failure to oversee some of the building maintenance, has now caused significant, tremendous casualty in one case, but that's not the only case. I mean, again, I think we can agree that the Champlain Towers collapse was kind of an anomaly, but since then there have been half a dozen buildings in Florida that have been vacated as a result of the unsafe conditions. So now the building officials are being called to task as to whether these buildings are safe, and the obligation was always there. It will always be there. This is just basically reminding you or compelling you to a new way of compelling you to honor that obligation.
Correct. And that's an excellent point, Lisa. I appreciate you bringing that up. So Sanisa, I want to kind of bring you back in. I know that your firm represents many associations throughout the state of Florida. Obviously here in Miami-Dade and Broward County, we've had our 40-year recertification. I do know some cities in Palm Beach and so forth have already put in their own guidelines. I guess if you could give us a perspective of what you're seeing. I know we were talking a little bit about it before the webinar. If you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the market when it comes to other counties outside of Dade, Broward, or our tri-county area, and what you're seeing in general of the conditions of the buildings, and what's the reaction of management or the board members? Are they accepting of this potential change? Are they fearful of it?
Well, so I'll tell you the impact that this unfortunate and tragic event had on the community, especially, tri-county area here, has been a very, if I can say, positive change in an attitude of the associations and the boards in terms of what do we do with the building. And since the collapse, we have had a tremendous amount of requests for inspections and assessments of the properties, ensuring that the properties are safe and sound. But more importantly, the follow-up as to what do we do after that particular inspection is done, if there is need for repairs, was there. I don't want to say, I don't like to generalize anything, but we're all been present in situations where we are aware of certain things, but can we wait 3-5 years? We have a big project and we want to replace the carpets in the corridors. Can we wait with the exterior? That has shifted now, and we are not waiting on anything with the exterior. And there was a great push, at least in the Tri-County area. Now, with this looming legislation coming in and affecting the entire state of Florida, I have had some experiences with, for example, West Coast in the Tampa region, and I think people are aware that it's coming. I don't think people are ready for it.
Yeah.
which, you know, is troublesome for multiple reasons, because to piggyback on your conversation from a little bit ago with Lisa, the whole idea behind the 40 year, and my opinion on this new legislation is to basically make sure that the buildings are maintained. The idea behind all of this is to maintain the building.
Yeah.
And although 40 years was a good idea, it may have been a long period of time to allow people to, I want to say neglect, but forget about their building.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which has led, which is going to bring us back to the reserve study, which has led to numerous projects that are 10, 15, 20 million dollars, and people are saying we don't have money to pay that. The idea is this, and I'll use an analogy. If you change the oil on your car every 7,000 miles, depending on your car and type of oil you put there, chances are you will never have to do a major recall of your engine throughout the life of that engine. The idea is the same for the buildings. If you spend a smaller amount of money, but on a frequent schedule, so let's say every 7 or 10 years, you are never going to be in a situation where you have to now assess for $15 million to do a major restoration project. So yes, direct impact on the buildings is going to be higher from the get-go, in the sense that now you have to catch up to all of the things that we didn't do in the past. But in reality, the long-term gain is the chances of special assessment for a major concrete restoration, major deck restoration, and that is going to decline significantly. Because again, you are now going to have to pay your $50 or $70 or $150. I don't really know what is the, you know, depending on the car you have, for your oil change, rather than paying $15,000 to replace the whole engine. That's the logic that this is going to enforce. And why do we have a 20-year requirement for coastal properties? Because they're way more exposed to adverse effect of the weather, of the salt, of the moisture, as opposed to the inland properties that are shielded and protected and have more life to it. But with all of that being said, I stated this from long before the Champlain collapse and before the new legislation. My opinion is you perform an assessment of your property every time you're ready to paint the property, every time you're ready to paint the building. You spend some more money, but you do assessment of the property, you address anything while you're painting, and you never have the need to do major work. That means every 7 to 10 years, depending on the type of paint, location of the property, and so on and so forth, if you're ready to paint, you do assessment. Don't wait for the city to be on top of you and saying, oh, now you have to do it. Do it on your own. First of all, you have more, freedom, more leverage to do things your way, because when the city goes on your back, you don't have anything. You have to do what they say at their timeline.
Yep.
So do it in your own pace, but do it on a regular schedule, and you won't have any problems. Agreed. Impact at the beginning might be higher because now we have to catch up, but long term is going to be way better for everybody, which I think is what scares people, again, on areas where they didn't have these requirements in the past, is that part, catching up. How do we get from where we are, which is potentially zero in some instances, to what Lisa was saying, fully funded? And by the way, Lisa, I saw questions in the audience. If you can explain to people, I think some of these, what does the fully funded means, and all some of those terms, maybe, people don't have exact understanding of some of those terms.
Yeah, actually, there's a very big industry-wide, nationwide dispute or discussion as to what kind of funding would be appropriate. Is it threshold funding? Is it percent funding? Is it baseline funding? Is it fully funded? Is it 100% funding? So all of these terms are somewhat amorphous, but the design of the Florida statute is for fully funded would mean you have your schedule. So the roof needs to be done in 3 years, the elevators in 10 years, the something else in 12 years. What you're funding on an annual basis enough money so that in 5 years you'll have the money to do the roof, that in 10 years you'll have the money to do the what did I say? Whatever, the elevators.
Elevator.
So that's what fully funded means. And obviously that needs to be reviewed on an annual basis. Not that you need a reserve study on an annual basis, but you need to review your funding to see whether or not you're in line with what you've already planned for and whether inflation is really going to change your figures. I have a client that recently indicated they had their reserve study, I think, in 2020, and they are now ready to do their cooling tower. They had reserved, I don't know, $350,000 for it, but it's really going to cost like $420,000. Now, again, they have the 350,000, so funding the gap is not significant for that particular community. But if you are planning never to special assess, you really have to readjust that funding on an annual basis to see where you're going and how you're doing.
And then I'm happy you brought that up, Lisa, because that does happen. So imagine an association that didn't have anything and had to change that cooling tower. I mean, having to figure out $100,000, it's much easier than having to figure out $440,000. And that's the impact. And Sinisa mentions it, clearly about the difference with reserves and the importance of having reserves. I know from a management side, our job would be much easier if the funds were available. And as Sinisa mentioned, I love the analogy of the car oil, because it really goes to the point. I know we preach this a lot here on our side, which is the paint. I mean, it's the envelope of the building. If you really stayed consistent with when you need to paint your building, depending that changes with paint product, as Sinisa mentioned, you're going to find yourself in a much better position. So many times when we go interview with a building, one of the first questions that we'll ask is, when was the last time you painted the building? Because it'll give us an idea of where the association stands with their maintenance. Also, it'll give us an idea. The next question will be is, how much do you have in reserves? Because in all fairness to board members as well, if you're put into a position of sitting on a board, you're new to the position, or you're sitting on there for a couple of years, the building's 40 years old, no one put the money away. It's difficult for owners to tell another owner that they live there, this is what you need to do. But as you mentioned, Lisa, earlier, it's your fiduciary responsibility to do so. That's crystal, I think, to everyone. But there's a difference between your fiduciary and also understanding that I have to make this difficult decision. And unfortunately, sometimes boards don't want to make that difficult decision. Let's leave that for someone else. And what's sad is, sorry, go ahead.
Well, so there was actually a question about the $10,000 minimum threshold. So that may be time to take a look at that as well, because if you have a $100,000 budget, $10,000 is a significant expenditure, but many of our associations have $2, $3, $5 million budgets. So yeah. Is it appropriate to require them not only to put in a schedule, which the schedule is great, but is it appropriate to require them to fund every item for $15, $20, $50,000 when really they could concentrate on the bigger ticket items and have that funding in place, because their budget can largely absorb some of these smaller items?
Correct. Yes, definitely. And as I was saying, with regards to making those difficult decisions, many of our communities, especially throughout the state of Florida, are with residents that are on fixed income. So imagine having to get them caught up for those associations that aren't. If they were properly funding from the beginning of the building, then they knew what they were kind of getting themselves into. Okay, this is the true maintenance cost for this property, because many have these maintenance fees that aren't really true, because they're just not putting anything away for reserves. So I wanted to give an opportunity. Sinisa noticed we do have many questions. I want to give an opportunity to some of our listeners that are here today. So I'm going to go ahead and start going off on some questions. I have here a question that says, why every 7 years? It takes several years to finish work. From one inspection to another, condos will be overwhelmed with engineering fees and continual renovations. I think they're basically asking why an inspection maybe every 7 to 10 years. Maybe Sinisa, you want to touch up on that?
Sure. So, and I've tried to answer a couple of questions that I read in the question and Q&A section. Why 7 years? Again, the number I think is mostly based on the exposure of the building and the assumed necessity to, again, paint the exterior, which paint becomes your primary protection of the building. So 7 years in coastal regions has been in an industry for the longest time as a, let's say, standard for when you have to repaint the exterior of the building. With that being said, going back to the logic that I tried to explain is if you basically inspect and perform timely repairs every 7 years, the project is not going to last 4 years, it's going to last 6 months or a year, or depending on the size of the building, year and a half, which means every time that you do this, the amount of repairs you're going to perform in the building is going to be less and less. And you're going to eliminate the need to basically do repairs. You're going to keep the building, purely as a maintenance, which means paint job, not a restoration job. So yes, you're going to pay a little bit more on engineers in a sense that you have to now have an engineer every 7 years. But in reality, when you talk about major structural restoration problem and project, the cost of engineer is really cents on the dollar as compared to the cost of construction. And to try to answer, somebody asked, what is the definition of coastal? Well, the definition of coastal, based on how the bill reads, is 3 miles, I assume, airline, 3 miles inland from the coastal line. And the coastal line is basically defined as the line with an open water. So I don't think that that means from any water. It means basically from the ocean line in 3 miles is going to be defined as a coastal line. And finally, the intent, the way the bill reads right now, is not to bring the building up to code. That was never the intent of the 40-year rectification. That was, and it's not intent of this particular code. The intent is to ensure that the buildings are properly maintained. With that being said, the bill still has, there is a special committee that is going to define exactly the scope of work of these inspections and the extent of these inspections are going to be required. That is not currently part of this bill. That's something that according to this bill will be designed and presented by the end of this particular year, if I read the thing correctly. But with that being said, again, we all assume that this is not going to be a code compliance project, that this is going to be a maintenance project. There is a chance that some items may be required to be brought up to code, similar to like Miami-Dade has the lighting section, and then protection in Miami-Dade unincorporated the protection of open water for parking spaces. But chances are that those are going to be relatively limited when it comes to the overall intent of these inspections.
Correct. And yeah, I mean, I saw that question there with the difference between the bay and the coastal line. So thank you for that clarification on that, because I know that there is some confusion when it comes to that. Lisa, I have a question here from Oro. I think you'd be best to answer this one. It says, is there any pending legislation to hold board members more accountable or a mechanism to apply some sort of pressure to ensure that board members' performance of their fiduciary duty is done?
Yes, actually, that is in the bill. Now, one of the bills, the 7042, it does have a specific sentence that would say the association through its board of directors is required to maintain the building, especially the items that are listed in that 301-4P, which is, as I said, there's a laundry list of seawalls, roofing, pools, elevators, and what have you. That's a really vague term. As far like what does it mean to maintain? We already have all of those arguments where an owner says, hey, your failure to maintain resulted in water intrusion into my unit. So, you haven't done your job, board of directors, because there's a failure here. So I think that's going to require a little bit more thought and attention. But as far as accountability, yes, one of the proposals also would expand the role of the arbitration program. I think the arbitration program is a little bit, less desirable these days, and specifically make a cause of action against the board of directors for failing to obtain the inspections within the timeframes of the statute, failing to distribute the inspection reports within the timeframes of the statute, failing to obtain the reserve studies, and then failing to fund reserves as would be required. So there's definitely an intent here to require a little bit more accountability. I want to go back though to what you said before, and that's about affordability. that's something that I talk about a lot, because I think it's inappropriate for someone to determine affordability based upon the current budget. Really, you have to assess affordability based upon the actual needs of the association. And that includes the deterioration of the building. Everything's going to deteriorate. Yeah. I said this on one of the webinars recently. Hey, when I was a teenager, I mean, I probably wouldn't see a doctor, maybe the dentist once a year, but I wouldn't see a doctor for 5, 6, years, let's just say. Now I'm in my 50s and it seems like I'm going to the doctor 3 or 4 times a year. So things require more attention as they age. But as Sinisa says, if you're on top of it, it won't be an instrumental or onerous project. If you're on top of it, if you're eating salads and fruits and exercising every day, you're not likely to have the same problems as somebody who has neglected their health and their welfare. So yeah, that affordability, and when it comes back to the statutes, the disclosures are important, and they've been emphasized in these statutes. Disclosures on every budget year, disclosures in the annual financial statement as to whether the reserves are being funded in accordance with the schedule or not being funded, and disclosures they're recommending in the estoppel statement. So that's for prospective purchasers to be able to obtain a copy of these inspection reports or a copy of the reserve studies and understand where the association, as far as funding is concerned. So really, we need to get on this from the front side, as opposed to right now, we're handling it from the backside, the catch-up issue. Let's handle it from the beginning, and then going forward, hopefully we'll be in a far better situation.
Correct. Yeah, like everything else, these things take time. I love the analogy of from a younger age to now, because that hits the nail right on the head. That's exactly it. If you're taking the proactive measures today to understand where you're at, understand where you're going to be at, then things are going to come around much easier, and it's going to be much easier to be able to maintain and manage, rather than just waiting till something really bad happens and having to manage that at that time. I have a question here for you, Sinisa, from an anonymous person. They're basically saying that building designers, engineers, or architects should write a how to maintain a building 5, 10, 15 years. I just get general knowledge, I guess, for our audience. Is there anything that say that your firm does to be able to give like a general, this is how to maintain certain things within the association? Is there any like a how-to manual for that?
Well, in general, that's a very broad question, because when we're talking about the building, the focus of this discussion today is the envelope and structural stability of the buildings. But you have many systems in the building, and the reserves usually encompass all or many of those, such as cooling towers, generators, heat exchangers, pumps, and whatnot. So when you're talking about those, there are manuals of how to maintain, how to inspect, and things like that usually are prepared by management companies, or management companies along with the engineers to combine, prepare a set of documents and follow those documents. When we talk about the exterior of the building and structural portion of the building, there is really not a great deal of maintenance that one can do on a very regular basis. Again, painting of the building is definitely one of those that you have to and should follow. Also inspecting the building in preparation of that paint, or after any type of a major weather event, such as a hurricane or a tropical storm, something that could potentially adversely impact the building, you should perform an inspection and address any type of issues timely. But timeliness in terms of structural stability and structural repairs, timeliness is the key. The longer you wait, the bigger the repair is, the more inconvenient it is, plus obviously way longer and costly. So when you talk about maintenance of the structure, maintenance of the exterior, painting, waterproofing, and roofing are the key elements. And the reserve study does help a lot in that, because it puts you on a schedule. It keeps you on the schedule, even if you don't want to fund the reserves. A lot of people say, well, we don't want to fund the reserves because, I don't know, we're going to live in a building 20 years from today, and I'm paying for something I'm never going to see. Or things like that, or everybody's crooked, the board is crooked, the management is crooked, and they're going to steal the money from the reserve. We don't want to put the money there. I've heard all the arguments against the reserve, but having the reserve is, in my opinion, as an engineer, not an accountant, not a financial person, is critical to put everybody in the building on notice when certain things have to be done in the building. If your reserve is there, it says you have to replace a cooling tower in, I don't know, 2027. At least every year you have in your mind, hey, 2027 is approaching, cooling tower is approaching. Let's check it. Let's see what we need to do. And it keeps you in the check that you have to keep an eye on it, you have to maintain it and potentially replace it. That's why the reserve study is important. That's why it's critical. And it's a key component, not just from a financial side, but from the maintenance side of things, because it keeps you in the check.
Correct. And I would add to that, I know it makes our lives, as you stated earlier, definitely some of the preventative items that are done within your community's management company does have part of it. And we can also work with the particular vendors that service that cooling tower to get into even more of the weeds of what your chief engineer. There are certain associations, more the medium size and smaller ones, that don't have teams on site. So they'll have to sub out the work to someone to be able to do it. But I know I can speak that when an association has a reserve study, it makes the managers and management companies' lives much easier, because you can kind of understand, okay, these are all the components within my property. Depending on the software that you use, you can even track those pieces of equipment, understanding what work orders are being done. And that way you can assess from a higher level if something needs to be replaced because you've done enough work orders for it. So, you know, there's so many advantages that you get from having a reserve study. Again, we're not trying to beat a dead horse here, but I think everyone's starting to get the picture of the importance of this reserve study outside of just from a budgetary side of being able to budget properly for what's needed. It also helps management to understand all the components and project. This is what we're expecting to change on these particular dates, because the reserve study will give you somewhat of an idea of when that item is going to reach its useful life. Lisa, I have a question here from an anonymous person that basically asked, can something from the roof reserves be used? Can monies from the roof reserves be used for, let's say, for painting?
So that depends on how you're reserving. So there are two different ways of reserving here in Florida. We have straight line reserves and we have pooled reserves. A straight line reserve is pretty self-explanatory. Anything that you're saving for roof or you're dedicating for roof is stuck in that roof account and cannot be utilized for any of the other reserve expenditures. In a pooled system, you're calculating your reserve contributions or based upon all of the components in the schedule, and you're entitled to use any of the funds in the reserve for the items on the component list as they become due. So that's the difference between the pooled and the straight line reserves. There was some discussion about bifurcating how associations reserve, meaning to straight line for the, as I said, the structural items, structure or that contribute to the structure of the dwellings anyway. And to allow pooled reserves for all of the other items. I think it's a little bit convoluted. We'll see what happens with that. But the proposed right now, any association can vote to take the funds out of reserves and use them for any other purpose. I think the legislation, and there's one that in particular would limit the use of reserve funds for other purposes. The Florida Bar Report suggested it be limited to advance payment of insurance premiums, in which case the reserves would be replenished in the 12 months, during the insurance contract, emergency expenses, or initial casualty repairs. Because if you have a major casualty, you may not have funds available to pay your deductible. You're obviously not going to, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to resolve a large insurance claim within the year. So utilizing some of those funds initially for your mitigation expenses would be permitted with the vote of the owners. It would not be subject to a board discretion. It would still require a membership vote.
Correct. And I agree with you that I did read that. I do find it of having to separate, kind of having straight line in one and pooled in the other. It's a little bit convoluted. I know it makes our lives, and then again, I understand the intent of it is to make sure that the items that within that straight line are not used for anything else, especially if it's for waterproofing, for painting, for structural. Totally get the intent. But many times, as the cooling story you mentioned, you find yourself in a situation where either, costs have gone up, and so forth. So it's kind of nice when you have the pool method that you're able to use those funds as long as they fall within that. You can use those funds without having necessarily to take a vote. I kind of want to leave it back here at you, Lisa. I have a question from Diana, and she asked, will owners still have the right to lower fully funded reserves, or will this change with the proposed legislation?
It depends on which legislative proposal is
actually
adopted. Now, I can tell you, legislators are loath to put people out of their homes. So if a fully funded reserve, if it's a cash funding, not an alternative type of funding, is going to take a $300 maintenance fee or to a $1,000 maintenance fee, that's not going to be palatable to the legislators, and again, it's not going to be palatable to their constituents. So there'll likely will be some consideration of that, but if the members waive, there is also a likelihood that they would only be able to waive up to a certain amount. The Florida Bar recommended no waivers in excess of 50% of what the funding should be. And we have yet to see, that's everything is in flux. We'll know a little bit more about that once there are other proposals. As you said, there was one proposal that came in really late last night. I haven't even had the chance to read it, so I don't even know what that says. And that was on the House side as opposed to the Senate side.
Yeah, and that was, I don't remember the exact month, but I do know it was 2024, which is basically 2 years from now. So that would be a major impact to our associations. Sanisa, I wanted to get an understanding of with all this that's going on, with all the potential changes that we're seeing that are being proposed. How are engineers managing in this environment? As you stated earlier, there's limited resources. How are you managing? What do your associations do with everything that you've heard that's potentially coming our way?
Well, I guess a lot of engineers, especially in this region, are still handling the aftermath of Champlain, and just as you probably majority of people know, the cities have had an immediate reaction and requested, especially City of Miami and City of Miami Beach, put an immediate request for a lot of buildings out there to perform their own inspections and report to the city. So we are still dealing with the aftermath of that. There is definitely a high demand for engineering services across the board in terms of making sure that buildings are safe and sound. That has been, slowing down a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. But it was followed through or followed up with the 40-year inspections. All of those that were delayed or deferred now are back on the table, and cities are also trying to get their documentation in order. So there is definitely a high demand for engineers. There are delays and times for producing reports and giving performing inspections are definitely increasing across the board. I would love to tell you that we can do everything in 3 to 7 days, but there is the delays are such that even this is not me, competition, my people that are in this industry are performing services with 30-40 day delivery times on inspections, and then another 30 days on reports. So something that before you were getting in 3 weeks, now you're getting in 2 months.
Yeah, I bring that question up, Sanisa, because I think it's important for our listeners, both from boards and management, that to start taking measures now and not to wait. As you stated, we're seeing it from a management side. Obviously, we work with your firm very well. We work with other firms, and we're seeing it across the board. And I'm speaking for individuals that are focused within our world, that have the experience and the expertise to deal with the structures and have dealt with condo associations for years. The demand is high. So, as a manager, if you're on this webinar, or as a board member, I think you just start asking some basic questions. When was the last time you painted the building? When was the last time we had it inspected? And just start getting the proposals, getting yourself ready. And as I stated earlier, if you're 40 years coming, it doesn't mean wait till you get that letter. Let's just get the process started earlier on, so that you can get on the schedule with the potential engineer, because the times have changed and supply and demand changes everything. And right now, engineers are in big demand.
The lesson to be learned is that if your children are good at math, Send them to engineering school.
Yeah.
Well,
that is the
on that
future.
note, I just want to say something, and it's an interesting, it's a perspective of what's happening, or there is a projection in the next couple of years, there is going to be basically 9 openings per one engineer. So
Wow.
there's going to be a real shortage of, and I'm not talking about structural engineers, I'm talking engineers in general.
Yeah.
So this is not to scare anybody into anything, or God forbid everybody should be an engineer because of that.
It's not that easy.
I'm not sure that I want to tell my kids to be an engineer. But with that being said, there is going to be a challenge, especially with the legislation that may make more difficult for even engineers to continue performing services unless they have additional certification, additional training, and all of that. So even with the existing force that we have in this world, it may be very challenging, let alone with all the new legislation that is coming. So, you know, it's tough to predict what's going to happen, but it's going to be a little bit, you know, dicey out there.
Correct. It's going to take it some time to work itself out, because as it said with the 5 years, you know, when there's a huge demand, you would want people to kind of come into the market. And I understand why we need to provide that protection. So yeah, it's going to be dicey for a while. So I want to be respectful of all your time. I did see we had some questions here that are maybe not necessarily 100% related to today's webinar. Please feel free to reach out to either of our organizations, either KBR, the Falcon Group, or Affinity, and we'll be glad to answer that. But I wanted to wrap up the webinar and give you an opportunity if there's any last golden nugget or tip that you want to give to either our board members or listeners on today's call. And I'll start with ladies first. Lisa, if you want to close off.
Well, I want to thank everybody for participating today. I mean, in some cases, we're kind of preaching to the choir because you've taken the opportunity and have the gumption to try to learn more about what is necessary for you to either manage your buildings or run your buildings, or as your obligations as an individual unit owner. Beyond that, the disclosure issues, and when I say disclosure, not just to new purchasers, getting that information out to your owners so that everyone is on the same page, or at least cannot complain that, oh, I didn't know. You know, board members are torn in so many different ways. I mean, they're torn to make improvements to the recreational facilities or the appearance of the lobbies, the appearance of the building. They're torn by people who say, no, don't, you can't raise my rate by a nickel or $5 or what have you. But you really have to honor those fiduciary duties, and sometimes those difficult decisions require you to make a decision that's even adverse to yourself. I mean, you may not be in the best financial position, but again, you as a board member, just like any other owner, are tasked with the maintenance and repair of this property. You're entrusted with this property, and it's an important responsibility. So hopefully having more guidance out there will enable you to attend to these items on a more timely basis.
Correct. Excellent point. Thank you so much, Lisa. Sinisa?
Well, again, thank you. Like Lisa said, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all the participants and people on this webinar. I hope we were able to provide some valuable information. I know that there are some questions that haven't been answered. I want to use this opportunity to maybe answer one more that may be directly linked to the bill, and that is that this bill is a little bit different than the 40-year. This bill does limit the height of the building to 3 stories and higher. The 40-year justification does not limit the height of the building. 40-year justification limits the square footage of the building or the occupancy, but has no limitation on the height. So the 40-year encompassed all types of structures, 3, 1, 2-story, if they meet certain criteria. This bill speaks exclusively of buildings that are 3-story or higher, but excludes buildings that have less than 3,500 square feet or are 2-family dwellings. So there are some changes there, but again, I hope that we were able to provide some valuable information. There is yet more information to come as this bill gets refined and goes through different stages. But be aware that there is a statewide law coming. To what extent, in what shape it's going to be, but there is going to be additional requirement for ensuring your property is safe and sound. The extent of that is still unknown, but as Rafael said multiple times, you better start preparing for it. And what's maybe odd about this, that preparation for this is something that we should have done from the beginning anyways, and that is making sure our properties are properly maintained. If you do that, you don't have to worry about any new legislation. Any new legislation is not going to affect you because you're already keeping your building up to par with anything that might be requested from you. So if you can take anything from me, ensure that you properly maintain your building and timely, and you have nothing to worry about.
Excellent points, Sanisa. Well, first, I want to start off by thanking the two of you for being here. It's always an honor to be alongside such reputable and excellent industry leaders within our community association management industry. I also wanted to thank the board members and the managers for really taking the time, and also future board members for taking the time to be on the webinar to gain the additional knowledge. I think all three of us have said it multiple times of how important it is to really stay in a proactive measure and really get ahead of this, making sure that you're communicating with your residents, as Lisa said, making sure that you're doing the right thing, as Sanisa said, because if you're doing what needs to be done, you won't have to worry so much of what's to come. But either way, do keep in mind that none of this is law, but it's important that we communicate it to our membership. So if it does become law, it's not something that all of a sudden comes out of the blue. We hope to have another webinar either before legislation passes or maybe right after to give everyone an update. I did receive some questions of, is this going to be posted? I'm sure all three firms will share it through their social media platform. We'll also place it on Affinity's YouTube page. That'll be up within the next 24 to 48 hours. So if you want to share that with your fellow board members or with your membership so they can get up to speed with what's going on, please feel free to do so. Again, thank you both for being here today. Thank you all of those that attended today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a great one, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.